Hello, it's Andrew Collins here. I want to tell you about the new edition of my book, Beneath the Pyramids, by way of a lecture, a presentation which I did at the Gaia Ancient Civilizations event at Boulder recently, but this one's a bit more personal because, I'm just telling you about it. And so, we can probably go a little bit behind the scenes on some of this. Now, the book is a new version of the classic work that I brought out in 2009 under the same name, which looked at every single angle of stories going from dynastic Egypt all the way through to Arab times and beyond to more modern times, relating to the idea of secret chambers and corridors existing beneath the plateau at Giza. And this is something which eventually led into the 5-year mission that myself and Nigel Skinner Simpson embarked upon, culminating with the discovery of Giza's cave underworld, which is entered via the Tomb of the Birds in 2008. We went in there 4 times. Now, I want to then now take it on to what's happened since then and what you can expect to find in the brand new chapters of the book, which amounts to about 13,500 words, 15 new illustrations. So let's have a look through these slides and I'll tell you a bit about them as we go along. Well, to start off with, we're all familiar with the announcements that were made in March from Corrado Malanga, Armando May, Filippo Biondi at a conference in Bologna, where they announced their discovery of megastructures existing beneath the second pyramid at Giza. Now, for this, they used satellite imagery based on data that was coming from about 400 miles above the Earth. Now, this is what's known as synthetic aperture radar imagery. And basically, this looks at all angles of the ground from different directions, creates almost like a 3-dimensional image of the ground. And this has been interpreted by this Italian team who go under the collective name of the CAFRE SAR project. And it's intriguing stuff. And I mean, basically, what they have discovered, as you already know, is structures inside the second pyramid and 8 what appears to be like tubular structures that penetrate deep down below the water table in a manner which, in all honesty, is very difficult to accept, other than the fact that we certainly know, as I'll come on to, that they're not the first person to talk about deep underground structures beneath Giza. But these 8 tubes eventually end in what they describe as 2 square chambers that are approximately about 80 meters across. Now that's big, obviously. And these are as much as a kilometer underground. But as I said, I mean, I'll be honest, I have no idea exactly, what they might have found. All I can tell you is that they are certainly not the first people to have discovered something, beneath the second pyramid, which is what I want to focus on now. I know that since this time, they've also detected, underground structures beneath the Great Pyramid, the Third Pyramid, the Sphinx, and other places on the plateau. But I want to concentrate on the second pyramid because that's the place that I've been looking at extensively for a very long time. Now, what we do know is that as early as 1977, the Stanford Research Institute, in association with the Ain Shams University of Cairo, detected underground, deep, large voids under the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid. These were at 50 meters and 14 meters beneath the ground. And they also detected structures underneath Belzoni's chamber, which is the main burial chamber that is cut into the bedrock beneath the middle of the second pyramid. They also found what appeared to be fissures beyond the northwestern corner of the second pyramid. So there's plenty there, but it's these deep underground structures beneath the southeastern corner area that I think are the most important and may constitute the entrance into something of significance. So obviously this is the second pyramid. Traditionally, obviously, this is the pyramid of Khafre, the second son of Khufu, the traditional builder of the Great Pyramid, which obviously, just its neighbour. And I mean, this is at the highest point on the plateau. I think this is important. I mean, that's actually just to the left, the actual highest point. But essentially, that pyramid is the place that commands the greatest view. And if you are going to put something into the bedrock, this is the place that you're going to be doing it. Because the distance between the base of this pyramid and the underground water table is about 50 to 60 meters. So that's plenty of space to create, underground structures if you so wish. And what you've got on the eastern side of this pyramid, going from its northeastern to its southeastern corner, is this massive megalithic platform with stone blocks that are anything up to 50 to 100 tons apiece. And they're all slotted together, presumably, supported by supports that are underneath them. And the function of this is essentially to, support the weight of the second pyramid. But it's long been suggested that there may be something beneath it. And if the Stanford Research Institute are correct, then that's indeed the case, that there is something underneath there. And I mean, you walk over these if you go to the second pyramid. And I mean, they are truly massive, and some of them have got gaps between them, and you can, drop something between them and you can hear it falling. So there definitely is quite a, vast area beneath them that has never, presumably, ever been explored. Now, this is a map of the Giza Plateau itself, and you can see the three main pyramids here. If I've got the cursor, that's the Great Pyramid, that's the second pyramid, that's the third pyramid. You've got the little Sphinx here, and this is the hills to the south of it. There's a place called Jebel Gibli, which we'll come back to. There's a well called Bir El Saman there. And this is the plateau. The plateau's probably a couple of miles across. And I mean, as you know, it's filled with tombs and, minor pyramids and mastaba tombs, which go back probably to the first dynasty. So roughly around 3000 BC. But it's evident that there was activity on the plateau before this time, because a number of burials belonging to the so-called Madi Butu culture were found in the vicinity of the Sphinx, suggesting that that was venerated when it was still a simulacrum. In other words, a natural feature that was coming out of the ground, where you could probably have seen its back and its head, and it probably would have looked like some kind of animal. People have obviously suggested that it could have been a feline, maybe a lion or a panther, or that it could be some kind of canine, or an animal of that description, a jackal, a wolf. And all of these were seen as guardians of the entrance into the cave-like realm known as the Duat. Okay, but we'll come back to that. Now, sorry, what I forgot to mention is this place here called the Tomb of the Birds. And this was the place that Nigel Skinner Simpson and I finally pinned down as the entrance into the cave underworld, which we obviously explored 4 times in 2008. And I mean, this is what you see when you actually enter into those caves for the first time. This is what we call the opening chamber, or the dome. And this is off to the right, entered through a very small entrance, which we managed to get through. And this is the beginning of a massive natural cave system, of which this chamber has quite clearly been modified to look to look rectangular in appearance. Now, what its function is unclear. There's a ledge on its eastern side that you can stand on and look down into this masses of fallen rock debris. I'm standing there right there. That's on the western side. That's a dead end. There is chambers there, but they don't go anywhere. And this guy here, that's Nigel Skinner Simpson, looking into the southern cave corridor that will continue on for about anything between 100 and 150 meters. And I'll show you where we go from here. Now, this is shots of the interior of the caves. That's my ex-wife, Sue Collins there. And it just gives you an idea of what you can see. I mean, there is plenty of ochre coming out of the walls, which are limestone. But there also seems to be a black substance on the walls, which we suspect is probably manganese. It's not burning. I'm pretty certain of that. And this is in a part of the cave where huge great blocks that litter the floor in the early part just suddenly disappear, and you can walk along it, along the entire length of the second part of it. As I said, these caves are created by water erosion over a very long period of time, tens, hundreds of thousands of years, arguably even longer than that. And it's likely that there is archaeology in them that goes back, maybe 100,000 years, provided that the cave entrance was open at this time. If it was closed, that's another matter. I mean, obviously, you've got the cave, the tomb there now, and obviously, there's absolutely no guarantee that there was a cave entrance right at the front of it that they then expanded to create the tomb. But I think that probably was the case. Now, that's me having come out of the caves after another day of surveying and exploration. And you can quite clearly see it's very, very dirty in there. In fact, it's actually full of bats and bat guano, which can be quite dangerous, as you can imagine. And there's also bugs in there, like something out of an Indiana Jones film. There's also spiders that we identified as possibly white widow, so obviously poisonous. And so it's a quite hostile environment in there, and it's incredibly hot as well. Now, this was the plan that I did of the caves after the final visit in 2008. And I named them the Kaf El Hanash Cave, the Cave of the Snake, and we'll come into why I gave it that name, and particularly in Arabic, as we go along. But the case is, where did the caves actually go to? And that obviously was the question on our minds when we came out of it. And the fact is that shortly after we came back from Egypt, what we discovered, well, my colleague, the engineer Rodney Hale, discovered was the fact that there was a radar satellite image of the plateau that had been taken in July 2007. So that's the year prior to us getting into the caves, that showed these lines going all the way from the area of the Tomb of the Birds, two of them, carrying all the way down to the northwestern corner of the second pyramid, which is basically there. That's where it starts there. Now, we wanted to eliminate that they could be, trackways, roads, contours. So Rodney created this map here that shows the contours, and it's quite clear that there's no direct relationship between these lines and the contours of the Giza Plateau. And what we concluded is that they must be something underground. Now, this was using SAR satellite imagery as it was in 2007, the same type of data that the Italian team are using today. And in theory, although this is not supposed to see underground, I think it does. I think it can see a short distance, possibly 10, 20, 30 meters. And that this is an example. It comes out looking like shadows, basically, crossing the area. There are many of them that you could see on the plateau, but these were the ones that were clearest. And I think that what's being shown here is the fissures and caves that are going all the way from the area of the Tomb of the Birds to the northwestern corner of the second pyramid, corresponding to the exact positions where the Stanford Research Institute did actually find the rock fissures in the northwestern corner. I'll do another image where I actually compare the two together. Obviously, I don't have permission to show the original picture from the TAR, the TerraSAR X satellite, but we've reconstructed this and it's absolutely correct as per what you see on that image. So the question is, what exactly might lie beneath the second pyramid? Well, in the original Beneath the Pyramids, I do talk at length about the so-called foundation texts that are found at various ancient Egyptian temples, now just in fragments, but the most complete version known popularly today as the Edfu building texts are found at the Temple of Horus at Edfu in southern Egypt, which you can see on the screen here now. And on the walls of the terminus, which is the exterior, walls enclosure that goes around it, plus in the interior, I should say, right the way through into the Holy of Holies, where you got this huge solar bark inside, you have accounts of the creation of the universe, the creation of the world, and what happens after that. And what happens is that there is a island that gradually emerges out of the primeval void, primeval chaos, the primeval waters. And this becomes the place where the first enclosure is constructed. And this is created by some people who are referred to as the primeval ones. Now, on the one hand, it's quite clear that they are ethereal beings, but on the other, they act as if they're quite clearly physical flesh and blood beings at the same time. So it's a mixture of both. In other words, I think that these people probably did originate as flesh and blood beings, but they became very much mythologized and formed into creation myths. And the story is that there was the central island, but there was also an island within that, a smaller island. The island was referred to as something like the island of the egg, which is a symbol of creation, the island of two flames, and then later the island of trampoline, obviously because of the activity on it. And what it says is that the primeval ones, who are also referred to as the wudu, which is an ancient Egyptian word meaning something like the eldest ones or the elders, create this enclosure and also install within it this object that is referred to as the Benet, which means embryo. But this exact same feature is also referred to as the lotus that shines from the center of the island, but it's also known as the throne. And it all seems to be referring to the same thing. And whatever this is, it has a radiance that shines out from this central island and is so powerful that it can push away the waters that encroach the island at certain times. So this is a power object. Now, what exactly it is, we can only but speculate, but we'll come on to that. But then something terrible happens because the Edfu account talks about something known as the enemy snake or the great leaping one, coming into the sky, but also on land, that causes mass devastation. There is a period of darkness, and there is also a major flood, and this flood completely drowns the primeval island and kills the primeval ones or the eldest ones. And we know that because thereafter they're referred to as ghosts. In other words, they're dead basically, but their spirits are still there. Um, and I think that we can see this as a memory of the Younger Dryas impact event or hypothesis, which talks about, the Earth going through the tail of a comet in 10,800 BC, which allowed fragments of this comet to enter into the Earth's atmosphere, break up, and literally pepper the northern hemisphere, creating these mass wildfires that sent this smoke up into the air that blotted out the sun, the moon, stars for a period of time. We don't know how long before it started falling back down as acid rain. And this all happened together, but it seems as if there were like other events going on, possibly for as much as 300 years after this time. At the same time, it would seem as if the sudden melting of the ice caps caused by this event sent a whole load of cold water into the Atlantic, reducing its temperature and reducing obviously the degrees, and in doing so triggered a mini ice age. And this lasted for 1200 years, right the way through until about 9600 BC. Now, again, I talk about this in other lectures, so we won't go on too much about it. But the other important thing here is that the Edfu texts then say that new beings turn up at this primeval island. They encounter the ghosts of the previous ones, but they start rebuilding. They rebuild the sacred enclosure. They will eventually end up creating the first temple. But the earliest of these beings, and there's a series of them, and it can get very confusing. I mean, I go into this in Beneath the Pyramids, but I go into it in even more detail in my book, The Cygnus Key, because I mean, I've tackled this subject for three separate books: Gods of Eden, um, Beneath the Pyramids, and also the Cygnus Key. And each time, I understand the text more and more. By the way, the main source of the Edfu building texts is a 1969 book called The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple by Eva Raymond, who was I think she was a Polish-born archaeologist who spent her time at Manchester University. And I mean, she was very much into Egyptian creation myths, and she looked at the Edfu building text very, very close, and she concluded that they related to a primeval, foundation somewhere in the area of Memphis in northern Egypt, and Memphis necropolis includes Giza, so it's very, very possible that these structures, this primeval land, this place of creation, did exist somewhere in the vicinity of the Giza plateau. But anyway, these new beings turn up, and they are led by a figure called the Falcon, and they themselves are known as the Falcons. And the way that they act, like sitting or standing on perches and things like this, it's quite clearly that they are taking on the form of birds. And I think that there's every chance that they are shamans. And this is some memory of shamans who came in and took over these sacred places. Let's assume that they're in the area of Giza, probably after the Younger Dryas event ended in 9600 BC. And it's said that they were followed by other divine beings or mythical beings who eventually end up being the gods of ancient Egypt, the Nita gods, and they're the ones that get together and create the first temple on the site. And the dimensions, the geometry, the ratios of that sacred temple is forever used afterwards to construct every temple in Egypt. And that's the reason why these stories are on the walls. It's so that they never forget where this knowledge of how to build the temples actually comes from. and obviously answering the question of, the ontological question of where did we come from? How did this world come into existence? Who created the stars, etc., etc. So the interesting thing is that there were very advanced settlements at this time, and even earlier than this time, at a place called Helwan in northern Egypt, within sight of the Giza plateau. I talk about this in great detail in my book, The Cygnus Key, and this representation here was done of one of the enclosures that I think was in the vicinity of Helwan. And this was done by my good friend, the artist Russell Hussein. And this is in the Cygnus Key. But what it also says in the Edfu building texts is that the falcons and also another set of divine beings known as the Sheptu utilized, it doesn't necessarily say that they created or built, but they utilized an underground structure that was at the center of this island, or certainly in the vicinity of it, known as the underworld of the soul, Duat Embar. It was also known as the place of the well, which may well refer to the access point into this. Now, it said that into this they placed power objects and relics, and which could be brought out and used in rituals. And at one point, they were brought out to use to push back the waters again. So it may well be that this so-called embryo or lotus or throne was one of these power objects that was contained within the underworld of the soul. So this really is our first indications that there are underground structures that I believe are located in the vicinity of the Giza Plateau. So the question then becomes, did the ancients really construct, underground, chambers of the sort that we're talking about? Well, for this, the easy answer is to go from Giza 1,000 miles or so into southeastern Anatolia, the area of Tash Tepe. Tash Tepe is the name that's given to this extreme high culture, nay, post Ice Age civilization that we know existed now in the area of the Shanli Urfa region, which is a traditional cradle of civilization. It's also the location of the original Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. But again, that's a story that's told in many of my books, most recently in my book, Karahan Tepe. The most famous of the sites of Tash Tepe is, of course, Göbekli Tepe, where you have a whole series of stone enclosures with these T-shaped pillars, which are anthropomorphic, human-like in nature, but they also have carvings in them. Karahan Tepe is another major site, Sayburj. But what's important is that in connection with almost all of these sites, although I will point out not Göbekli Tepe yet, but certainly Karahan, Sayburj, and various other ones, you have deep underground structures. We call them hypogeums after the hypogeum in Malta. And you have these incredible cave tunnels, like you see here, just outside of Llanlurfa, hypogeum. There's my colleague Hugh Newman inside one of them there at Sayburj. Karahan Tepe there in the northern hill, which is where I'm coming out of one of these structures there a few years ago. Karahan Tepe is right at the north of this. And in a hill to the south of Karahan Tepe, you have a series of rock dwellings, which we believe probably do go back to Tash Tepe times and may even have been the homes of the shamans that actually served Karahan Tepe. And I have no doubt at all that at least some parts of these underground structures go back at least to 8,000, 9,000 BC. But what's so interesting is that I'm coming out there of a beehive shaped structure, which is considered to be a cistern. And these are also found at many of these Tash Tepe sites. And it's accepted today by some archaeologists that we should be looking out for these cisterns that usually have small circular openings for evidence of the possible presence nearby of previously unknown Tash Tepelah sites, which, by the way, there's about 12, 13 that we know are definitely there, although the archaeologists suspect that we're looking at as many as 40 to 50 in this region, which, again, as I say, will almost certainly constitute evidence of a civilization. Beyond this, if we go into central southern Turkey, we have the underground cities of Cappadocia, the most well known of which is Derinkiyu. And as I cite in my book, From the Ashes of Angels, that came out as early as 1996, that I found evidence when in Cappadocia, at Derinkiyu and other sites, that the earliest phases of these underground cities goes back to 11,000 BC. I mean, as I said, I wrote about this in 1996. I know Graham Hancock has also written about this. I mean, he consulted me before he wrote about this. I think it was in Magicians of the Gods. So, we're pretty certain that we are dealing with structures which go back to the age of Tash Tepelah and even before the Younger Dryas began. So all of this is happening in Turkey, which clearly is not Egypt. But is there a bridge, a link between what was going on in Anatolia at this time and ancient Egypt? Well, the answer is yes. We've already mentioned this place called Helwan, and during the 19th century, excavations took place there where a number of very highly specialized stone tools were discovered, including this particular one that you can see on the screen here now, which is known as the Helwan point. It's a barbed and tanged, type of a projectile point, which is very distinctive. I mean, you can't really, confuse this with anything else. Now, at the time, the age of this wasn't really known, but very gradually they found many other examples in the Levant, the different countries, different sites there going back to the early Neolithic. But what's most important is that in 1997, the archaeologist Bahattin Çelik, who was one of the persons that identified many of the Taş Tepelah sites for the first time, including Karahan Tepe, was excavating at a site just on the northern side of Balıklı Göl, which is also known as the Pools of Abraham, very important pilgrimage site and tourist location today in the heart of Şanlıurfa's old city, where just 4 years earlier they'd found this 6.5 feet tall statue that you can see on the screen here now, which came to be known as Urfa Man, or the Balıklı Göl statue. Now, it has no mouth, it has obsidian discs for eyes, it has ears, this nose, and it has genitalia, which is both male and female. This is something that has been researched and studied by my good friend and colleague, Debbie Cartwright, a matter that we can't really go into, but the importance of unisex or hermaphrodite beings in this story is not simply confined to Turkey, but is also found, we'll see shortly, in Egypt. And I think there's a commonality there. So if there are structures in Anatolia that go back to anything to like 11,000 BC, I don't see any reason why there should not be similar structures at key places in Egypt, including Giza, and that they're somewhere beneath the Giza plateau. And I think what may have happened is that the Tash Tepelah people, who clearly, through the presence of the Helwan point, both at Şanlıurfa, but also at Helwan and all points in between, shows cross-cultural contact. And I think that what happened is that the Tash Tepelah people entered Egypt probably anything between 8,000, 9,000 BC, maybe slightly earlier, came to the Giza Plateau and they found monuments and structures that were already present, maybe added to them, maybe they were connected with the underground caves that we discovered in 2008, and revered Giza. And I think that this was the start, really, of what eventually would become the Giza pyramid field over a very long period of time. So, obviously, the falcons, I think, mentioned in the Edfu building text, these bird shamans are the shamans that we have long associated with Tash Tepelah. I don't necessarily think that the falcon was their main bird. I think that in Anatolia, it was almost certainly the vulture, which was a symbol of death and rebirth. It was also a symbol, obviously, of excarnation of the soul and the carrying of the soul by way of a psychopomp from this world into the next. Having said that, the importance of different soul birds changes from region to region. So it may well be that when it came into Egypt, that it was much easier to adopt the falcon, the kite, the hawk as the main shamanic bird in connection with shamanism. So, in other words, what you see in front of you is one of the sort of Tash Tepelah, or localized form of the Tash Tepelah enclosures that would have been at Helwan, as I describe in my book, The Cygnus Key. So we come back to what exactly is underneath the plateau. And the key almost certainly is Hermes Trismegistus. He becomes the first major clue because it is said that the second pyramid houses the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus. Okay. And these ideas come from a people known as the Sabians or the Chaldeans, whose main center was the ancient city of Haran in southeastern Turkey. They were also at Şanlıurfa, the ancient city of Şanlıurfa. Chaldeans were ancient astronomers, ancient astrologers, they were soothsayers, they were magicians. And as I show in my books, particularly the last book that I brought out, which was Karahan Tepe, Civilization of the Anunnaki and the Cosmic Origins of the Serpent of Eden, that the wisdom and knowledge that was passed down from Tash Tepelah eventually filtered through places like Haran and Şanlıurfa, but particularly Haran, and thus became the basis of the religious traditions and shamanic traditions of the earliest peoples of Haran, which we know go back to at least 6 to 8,000 BC. You know, even though the Chaldeans themselves, or the Sabaeans, as they're also known, don't really come into their own as far as literature is concerned until around 2,000 years ago. And they existed at Haran right the way down through Arab times, many of them being converted following the Arab invasion. But they continued on at Haran right the way through to medieval times when Haran was sacked, completely razed to the ground by the Mongols in the 13th century. And at that point, all of this knowledge filtered into other key wisdom centers like Aleppo and Damascus in Syria, and also obviously Baghdad in Iraq. Obviously, some of it was retained in places like Şanlıurfa, which clearly was a mystical center and probably continued to be so right the way through until relatively recent times. Now, Hermes Trismegistus ultimately is simply a Hermetic or Greek form of the Egyptian god Thoth, or Thoth if you want to refer to him under that name. His original name was Nahute or Jahute, although it would seem that the Greeks couldn't really pronounce that, so for some reason they called him Thoth. And he was the god of mathematics. He was the god of geometry. He was the god of sacred, architecture. He was also the god who invented astronomy and probably astrology as well. And he was also the keeper of the records, records relating to life itself, literally, which I think is probably what he's holding in his hand there. He's got the records, he's got the pen, he's recording everybody's lives. Um, and of course, this brings us on to Edgar Cayce. We've already mentioned him. He was an American psychic, very, very famous. He would go into trances, give medical pronouncements, but these medical pronouncements would also contain what were referred to by his followers as life readings, and often these contained what appeared to be historical information, particularly about Atlantis and ancient Egypt and the Middle East. And this information basically suggested that the Sphinx marked the entrance into an underground secret chamber called the Hall of Records, within which were the records, the information, the wisdom, the knowledge of the Atlantean peoples, but also the peoples coming out of the area of the Caucasus. That's important. It's not simply about Atlantis here. And of course, the Caucasus and the area around Mount Ararat is not that far away from Shanliurfa. And it's the very area that I say that the Tashtepala culture really had its foundation. I say this in my book, From the Ashes of Angels, as early as 1996. So the Edgar Cayce Foundation and its research branch, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, have basically been looking for the Hall of Records actively since the 1950s. Most of Edgar Cayce's readings relating to the Hall of Records came out between the 1920s and his death in the 1940s. But the research really didn't begin until the 1950s, and it's continued really through to the present day. And indeed, they did help myself and Nigel Skinner Simpson, in our own expeditions to find the cave underworld in 2008. So, in other words, coming back to Thoth here, is it possible that what Edgar Cayce referred to as the Hall of Records relates to the fact that Thoth was the keeper of records in ancient Egyptian tradition, and the fact that the tomb of Hermes is said to be the second pyramid? Is it possible that Thoth originally was indeed associated with the Giza plateau and in particular the second pyramid? That's something that we're going to be looking at now. But before we do, let's look at the cult associated with the center for the god Thoth at Hermopolis in Middle Egypt. Now, according to their creation myth, which has similarities to that of Edfu, there were 8 beings that came into existence originally, 4 pairs, 4 male-female pairs. And this started with 1 pair, male-female, and then a second pair, male-female, until there were 8. Well, the names of these gods are very, very interesting. The first 2 is Cook and Coquette. Cook means darkness, and obviously Coquette simply is the feminization of that with the T at the end of it. The second pair, they're Nun and Nunette. And this basically means, Nun means the primeval waters, and obviously Nunette is a feminization of it, and so on and so forth, with the final pair, which is Amun and Amunet, simply meaning hidden, and the female version of hidden. And it's said that these 8 beings come together in the primordial void that exists outside of everything, before everything, and they create this cosmic egg. And this then explodes to form the firmament, the heavens, but also the world itself below. And interestingly enough, it said that the remnants of that shell actually can still be found to this day beneath the temple of Hermopolis, which I find a very interesting legend, bringing it into sort of a modern day as if they're still there. The important point here is that these 8 beings, the Ogdoad, which Ogdoad simply means 8 ultimately, parallel those 8 beings, or I should say, they are 8 beings in the Edfu text, the primeval ones. They were also 4 pairs. But whereas the Ogdoad The males had the heads of frogs or toads, the and the females had the heads of snakes. The primeval ones were four bulls and four cows. But there were still eight beings that bring everything into manifestation. And you can link this with the Ennead in the Heliopolitan creation myths, where you have eight beings and a ninth being Atum, the original creator. But let's not get too complicated at the moment. And I can't help associating the Ogdoad with these eight structures that the Cartwright SAR project have linked with these tubes that penetrate down into the water table beneath the second pyramid. Now, clearly, this is their interpretation of the data, and we have no way of knowing whether this is correct or not. However, what's important here is the fact that there are creation myths associated with the Ogdoad at another location in Egypt, and that is in the Fayum. And this is something that I found out when I was writing the book, The First Female Pharaoh, about Sobek Neferu, the first woman to wear the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. A book that came out a couple of years ago. Is that there is a book that circulated in the Fayum known as the Book of the Fayum. And although it's first written down in Greco-Roman times, it clearly is recording the myths and legends of the most sacred places around the Fayum Lake, which was actually known as Lake Moris. And this is this huge, great inland sea within the Fayum Oasis, which is about 60 miles to the southwest of Cairo, on the west bank of the Nile. And here, the story to do with the Ogdad is that there was like this sort of virgin nothingness, and they dig down into this virgin land, and eventually waters start rising up from its base and fill this area that they've dug out to create the Fayum Lake as a representation of the primeval waters. And this then becomes the womb waters of this goddess who's identified with this very ancient deity by the name of Neith. And it's said that from these primeval waters rose the sun god in the form of a crocodile known as Sobek, who is the son of Neith. And he rises up out of the waters and becomes the sun, and then goes around, and then at night he will come down back into the waters, take the form of a crocodile again, swim through the waters at night, and then at the point of dawn he'll rise up and become the sun again. And the idea that you've got these eight beings, creating this huge area that the waters then rise up into, reminds me of the fact that these tubes are going down into the water table. Now, I have to link the two together, the Ogdoad with what might exist beneath the second pyramid. I have to do that. But there's more evidence to link the god Thoth with the second pyramid, or certainly the area of the second pyramid, in my opinion. And this comes from a text known as the Westcar Papyrus that dates the same age as Sobek Nofru, the first female pharaoh, in particular her father, Amenemhet III, who reigned probably around, what was it, about 1850 BC, towards the end of the Middle Kingdom in the so-called 12th dynasty. And the Westcar Papyrus has three tales within it. So allegedly they're fictional, but they clearly have kernels of knowledge and information within them. And one of them is Khufu's quest to find what is referred to as the number of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth. Now, it's said that Khufu, who we know is the builder of the Great Pyramid, that he needs this information, he needs this number so that he can build his horizon. And the term horizon is that which was given, it's a word arket in ancient Egypt, to the pyramid field, the Khufu pyramid field. Um, and so, in other words, the suggestion is that he needs this information to construct the Great Pyramid and the monuments associated with it. Let's say the Mortuary Temple, the Valley Temple, the Causeway, etc., etc. In other words, the geometry, the mathematics is needed to construct the Great Pyramid. Now, I find this fascinating. So where was he looking? And according to the story, he goes off to see this soothsayer that basically says, "Look, mate, you're not going to find it, but you can start looking in a box somewhere in Heliopolis and whatever." Now, in that story, he doesn't actually find it, but I don't think that actually matters because the fact is he was looking for it, and I think that there's every chance that he was looking for it, but I think also so was his son, Khafre, the traditional builder of the second pyramid. So yeah, okay, so this is the horizon of Khufu. Just out of interest, although this relates specifically to the pyramid itself, it has been proposed that the term Arket Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, might actually originally have related to the entire Giza pyramid field. The reason for this is that Egyptologist Mark Lerner determined that there was a solar alignment from the back of the Sphinx. If you look between the first and the second pyramids, you can see the sun setting between them at the time of the summer solstice, and that the shape that the two pyramids create is that of the archet, which basically means like a sort of, like a loop, that the sun will go down, almost like a sort of, a horse saddle sort of shape. Now that may or may not be true, but as I said, the horizon of Khufu is generally associated with that. Okay, right. What more can we find out about this? Well, if we apply a grid to the Giza Plateau, connecting it with the most important sites, some very interesting facts emerge. If we have in the northwestern corner up here the Tomb of the Birds, which is on the exact same latitude as the center of the Great Pyramid, and by virtue of that, the subterranean chamber immediately beneath it. Plus, you have the Sphinx here. You have Jebel Gibli, which is considered to be the survey point or the datum, which was probably used to construct or design the pyramid field in the first place. I mean, this was the place that Mark Lerner, for instance, began his mapping of the plateau in the Giza mapping project, whatever it is, that he did, going from there to a series of other points to completely map the place. So it makes sense that this was the beginning. Also, Jebel Gibli, one of its original names was basically Tafaya, which means the place of beginning, the beginning, the first point. It's also referred to as the fourth pyramid occasionally because it's such a prominent feature on the southern side of the pyramid. Plus, also, the highest point is exactly due south of the head of the Great Sphinx, which, remember, was originally a natural monument that stuck out of the ground and that almost certainly was revered thousands of years before the pyramids were constructed. So anyway, we'll do that. So we'll look at all of these. I'm not going to include the third pyramid because it seems to have a different role as far as the geometry of the plateau is concerned. But here's something that of interest. If you cross from one corner, well, from all corners of this grid, it exactly crosses in the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid. And of course, this is precisely in the same area that the Ain Shams University, in association with the Stanford Research Institute, found these underground structures at 50 and 14 meters beneath the ground back in 1977. The other interesting point here is that point in the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid is exactly due west of the Sphinx, which is aligned onto that and obviously faces away from it towards the east. And just remember for a second, Edgar Cayce saying that the Sphinx marks the entrance into the Hall of Records. Is it possible that the Sphinx does actually mark the position of the entrance into some kind of underground structure, and that everything is designed with that in mind? In other words, this is what Edgar Cayce was actually picking up on in some manner. Now, the Sphinx we know as a feline, a lion with the head of a pharaoh. That pharaoh is identified as Khafre, but of course there is a lot of controversy over whether it is or it isn't Khafre. And the chances are it could be Khafre, it could be Khufu, it could be a much earlier, pharaoh. My colleague, the geologist John Reed, proposed that it could have represented the pharaoh Nemra or Ra-Neb, sorry, Neb-Ra or Ra-Neb, from the second dynasty, who was the guy that created the cult of Ra. And he finds links between him and some of the foundations of activity on the Giza plateau. But the other possibility that was put forward by my colleague Robert Temple, the author of books like Egyptian Dawn and the Sirius Mystery, is that the Sphinx originally was a feline, or in fact, he says a jackal, in other words, Anubis. Now, I don't think it was possibly a jackal because, as this overlay that I created here with the help of my colleague Rodney Hale shows, it just wouldn't make good geological sense, even with the head being a much harder member of limestone, as we know that it certainly is. But there's no reason why, as a creature, as a simulacrum, that it could not have been seen as canine in nature, or certainly wolf-like in nature. In other words, I mean, for instance, both the wolf and felines acted as guardians of the entrance into the cave underworld of the Duat. So I don't think it really matters whether it's a feline or a canine. It both has exactly the same reason. Then eventually, obviously, it was taken over by the dynastic Egyptians and given the head of a pharaoh that we see today. By the way, the Sphinx enclosure would have been created at a much later date to buck up to the pre-existing second pyramid causeway. But again, that's something that is outside the remit of our talk today, but I go into detail of that in the Cygnus Key. So, okay, so on the left, we've got this spot in the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid. And this is where it would be in the cutaway of the pyramid. So, what exactly is there? Can we get some idea? I mean, yeah, all right, it could be some kind of chamber of creation, but is there anything more? Well, let's go back to that grid that we created, with the Tomb of the Birds in the top northwestern corner, Gibble Ghibli in the southeastern corner, and the other monuments conforming to that grid. And what we find is that if we use that point in the southeastern corner area, that if lines are extended from it to key spots like the summit of the second pyramid, the summit of the Great Pyramid, the head of the Sphinx, and to Jebel Ghibli, that they all have very regular angles between them. 10 degrees, 45, 30, 60, 35. Now, the commonality between those angles is that they can all be devised by 5, suggesting that we might not be dealing with the breakdown of a circle into 360 degrees, but the breakdown of a circle that is 1/5 of that, which is 72 degrees. And if that's the case, then the angles between these now become 2 degrees, 9 degrees, 6 degrees, 12 degrees, and 7 degrees. And they together form exactly half of a 72-degree circle. So why would that be important? Well, this is that 72-degree circle, of which you can see that due east of it would be the head of the Sphinx. So is there any precedent or any reason that we might be doing this? Creating a 72-spoked wheel based on the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid, where it's very likely that there is some kind of entrance going downwards into an underground structure. What does it present? Okay, well, for this, we have to look at texts of the underworld. Now, these were written from the very earliest days, initially on the walls of pyramids from the 5th dynasty onwards, from about 2350, to so-called pyramid texts, then on to other forms like the coffin texts, and eventually the so-called Amduat text, the book of that which is in the underworld. And these describe the means by which the deceased, most obviously the pharaoh, is able to navigate the cave underworld and then exit and then rise up into the sky where they will access the stars. Now, obviously, there are different forms of how they access these stars. Some talk about them going to Orion, some talk about them going directly to the northern sky, part of the sky, but certainly the destination of the soul is always the circumpolar stars, the stars that never set in the northern part of the sky. This is where the dead in their form of Osiris will eventually become united with their mother Nuit, who is the mother of Osiris, and enter into the afterlife. But the most important text here is the Amduat text, the book of that which is in the underworld, that's used mostly during the New Kingdom period. And it's broken down into 12 parts, 12 different hours, like hypothetical hours of the night, from sunset through to sunrise. And it is within the 4th and 5th hours of the night that the deceased will gradually be reborn, or certainly after he's passed through these areas. And they are given the name Rostau. And Rostau is the ancient name of Giza. And the pictorial representations of the 4th and 5th hour of the Duat clearly show boats sailing through some kind of underground cave realm. And I could go into detail, and I do in Beneath the Pyramids in the section that pre-existed, the modern part, to show how similar that is, not only to Giza, but also the idea of the creation myths. And that, in my opinion, it is somehow describing Giza in pre-dynastic times. But what's important is that within the 4th hour, there is an area of Rostau, which is, by the way, presided over by its patron deity, which is Sokar or Sekar. Now, this is a hawk-headed god. You can see him on the screen there now. And he was the guardian of the plateau at Giza. In fact, when we found the importance of the Tomb of the Birds, and we found that bird mummies had been found within the tomb and put within the walls and whatever, I assumed that there was a possibility that this related to the cult of Sokar. In other words, that these bird mummies were being left as honor as offerings to him at the entrance into Giza's cave underworld. Now, it's said that within the 4th hour of Rostau is something known as the Circle of Sokar, also known as the Circle of Amente. Amente or Ament simply means the hidden. So it means the hidden circle. And the implications is that this is at Giza. So is it possible that this hidden circle of Sokar is something reflective of that which is above ground at Giza, but also below ground as well? But if so, why does it have to be, 72 spoked in nature? And is it guarded by the Sphinx? So what then is this number of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth, which I do associate with the second pyramid? Well, one clue may well come from the Rhind mathematical papyrus, which also dates to the time of Sobek Nofru and also her father Amun Emet III. In other words, probably around 1850 to 1800 BC. And in this, you have a series of exercises, mathematical exercises, one of which is virtually how to create your own pyramid. But what's so interesting is that it alludes to something really important in mathematics, and that's the fact that the area of a square that has units of 8, in other words, that it's 8 this way and 8 that way of any particular unit, is the same as a circle of 9 units across. In other words, the area of both the circle and the square, but the circle being 8 units and the circle being 9 units, are exactly the same. And of course, 8 times 9 equals 72. Now, 72 is a key number to cyclical time, okay, on a number of different levels. For instance, the cycle of Venus is 8 years. In other words, where it rises, shifts and comes back to approximately the same position every 8 years. And during that 8-year cycle, it will create in the sky a perfect 5-pointed pentagon. Or if you want to be a little bit more exotic, almost like a rose in the sky. Here you can see on the screen here one interpretation of it. And 9 of these cycles is 72 years, is exactly 72 years. And these 9 times 8-year cycles of Venus were definitely very important to ancient cultures. I talk about this, in the new section of the book Beneath the Pyramids. 72 years is also 1 degree in a great year of 25920 years. Now, this is something that's found in Platonic tradition. In other words, after the philosopher Plato, he talks about this in his book as the great cycle, the great year. And the figure that he gives is essentially 25,920. And 1 degree of that is 72 years. The other important thing is that the ancient Egyptians had a calendar, an astronomical calendar, that was made up of 36 so-called decans. And these were based upon the rising every 10 days of a new constellation across a period of 360 days, making 36 constellations in all. And coming into the late dynastic period, this worked hand in hand with the Babylonian and the Greek inspired 12 sign zodiac. And this is brought together in the round zodiac of Dendera, which you can see on the screen here now. But what's interesting is that the 36 decans were actually split into pairs, and to create actually 72 parts. And this is something I'm actually still researching at the moment, looking into Sethian and Gnostic texts like the Nag Hammadi scrolls, which also talk at great length about the relationship between the division of time of 12 into 72 into 360, which are all obviously divisions of time and divisions of space, and obviously divisions of the sky itself, turning about the cosmic axis at the center of it. So, in other words, 72 is a division of time and division of space that was carried through from ancient Egyptian astronomy through Greco-Egyptian times and was inherited by the early Hebrew and Christian and Gnostic traditions that would come out of that and would be recorded in the Nag Hammadi library that was found exactly 80 years ago at Nag Hammadi in Middle Egypt, just to the north of Abydos, which contains a whole series of tracts and gospels that are Gnostic in nature. But it also appears within what's known as Sethian material, Sethian gospels, which are allied to Gnostic texts as well. And here is exactly that. So, as I said, just to emphasize here, the 72 very important in Gnostic texts, such as the Nag Hammadi. It's not the Ham Hammadi, of course, what I've just said there. Need to change that. Found it in 1945. Right, so just to recap here, Nag Hammadi texts such as the hypostasis of the archons speak of the Ogdoad as the creative personification of the eighth heaven, existing in the waters, the Mayam, above the firmament, Rakia, of Genesis 1:6, the same place as the Egyptian Ogdoad. So let's break that down. The division of time and division of the sky is seen to be above that of the seven heavens, which are the usual heavens. And these seven heavens are determined by the seven planetary influences. Beyond those is the firmament, which you would have the 12 signs of the zodiac. And beyond that is the eighth heaven. It's within the eighth heaven that you have the waters above the firmament that you can see in this sky here. And this is the realm that's outside of the physical universe. It's above it and also below it. And this is the primeval waters. And this also is known as the Ogdoad. Now, Ogdoad can simply mean the eighth heaven, but it also relates to 8 individual intelligences that have an influence upon humanity. And they exist in exactly the same place as the Ogdoad in ancient Egypt. In other words, it's pretty obvious that the Ogdoad of Gnostic tradition are from the same source, primary source, as the Ogdoad in ancient Egyptian tradition, particularly associated with the cult of Thoth, and that these are beings that exist outside of the firmament, beyond it. In other words, in some kind of realm that exists outside of physical matter itself, outside of atomic matter. But then we come into the 72 forms of the infinite name of God, which, if understood and also spoken, enables access to the eighth heaven. In other words, if you have knowledge of these 72 names, then it allows you access to the eighth heaven. In other words, outside of the realm of the seven heavens itself, to connect with God himself, if you like. But more specifically, it said that it enables contact with the throne of glory, the Mekibar. And this is part of what's known as the Ezekiel or the Mekibar tradition. And these obviously based upon the visions of Ezekiel in the Old Testament, of him encountering the throne of glory and the different divine or celestial beings associated with the throne of glory. So is it possible, therefore, that the Bennett embryo, the lotus or throne of the homeland of the primeval ones, who are by eight, remember, four pairs, just like the Ogdad, relates to the throne of glory, the Mekhibar of Hebrew and Gnostic tradition? And if that is correct, well, I say Gnostic, it's mostly what they call Mekhibar tradition. And if that's correct, is that a memory of ancient Egyptian astronomical information about the division of the sky and the division of time? Very specifically, not into 12, not into 360, but into 72 parts. Was this 72 and the center of it some kind of cosmic axis represented by an omphalos, some kind of stone or a power object that is remembered in the Edfu Building text as this Bennett embryo? So is this what awaits us beneath the pyramids? Some representation of the turning point of cosmic time, of the division of space into 72 parts, some kind of cosmic axis or axis mundi. Again, this is something that I talked about in detail in the original form of Beneath the Pyramids, but we expand on that in the new version. And from that point onwards, we can really just speculate. And this is a great story, and I need to tell you this as the final part of this little presentation. There was a guardian of the caves at Giza. We encountered him. You can see a picture of him here. I won't give his name. And he knew about the caves when we were there. He came up and basically said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "Do you know about the caves?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely. I know about the caves." He said, "But I will never go into them." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because they are haunted by a giant snake called El Hanash," which basically just means the snake anyway. And I mean, this was before we went into it, I think on the third and fourth occasion. So it did quite worry us, thinking, well, maybe there is a snake down there. And we'd actually hear some kind of creature beyond the furthest reach that we got, which we called the tube. And it was one of the reasons why we didn't go any further. We could clearly hear something moving about inside the caves. And it certainly wasn't us. And it certainly, wasn't bats. Basically, it was something much bigger. And I mean, I'd never heard this term El Hanash, particularly in association with the plateau. But a little later, I came to know of a legend, a prophecy associated with El Hanash, which I believe is actually quite old. And the story goes is that El Hanash guards this diamond, this presumably giant diamond, in what is now commonly referred to as the Hall of Records, but I think this is just a modernization of an ancient term relating to chambers beneath the plateau. And it is said that this diamond has the ability to push back the waters and rivers, which reminded me immediately of the embryo talked about in the Edfu building texts. And it said that anybody that tries to approach this diamond, and quite clearly El Hanash, will be blinded by the spit of El Hanash, presumably after El Hanash puts down the diamond to be able to carry this out. But that one day, when the end of times is near, somebody will enter into this Hall of Records and they will encounter this diamond and learn its knowledge and wisdom, but they must never take this diamond away from it. And they will only be blinded in one eye by El Hanash. Now, this is a very peculiar story, and I wouldn't have taken much notice of it if it hadn't have had the name El Hanash associated with it. So what exactly is this diamond? Is it a memory of the Bennett embryo, the lotus, the throne, the throne of glory, the Mekhibar? Is that what we are waiting to discover beneath the pyramid at Giza? And does this allow us contact perhaps with the Ogdoad, the primeval ones, the Wuru, the eldest ones or the elders? And why is 8 so important? Has it got something to do with the mathematics of the plateau? Has it got something to do with the number 72? Something to do with the division of space? And what exactly are the Ogdoad, if we can see them perhaps in terms of an intelligence? Are they some kind of trans-dimensional intelligence or some kind of non-terrestrial, you know, force out there, or is it simply that they are individualized personifications of what I call the mind of God, not God himself, the mind of God, some kind of collective unconscious, some kind of Akashic records, relating to what Edgar Casey himself said, that the Hall of Records contain the knowledge of some kind of, prior civilization. And is that knowledge still available today? And is it relating to not just the cosmos, but that which is beyond it, that which is in the eighth heaven, that which is symbolized by the glory of God himself? So this is something which we need to know more about, all of this. And I'm going to speculate in the sense of to say we can't drill down beneath the second pyramid or even by its side and determine exactly what is down there. This is something that probably will not happen in any of our lives. I mean, not least of all because the Egyptian authorities are not going to allow it. But why is all this coming out now? I mean, we obviously don't know exactly what the Italians have discovered, but it's prompted everything. It's prompted me to bring out this book again, to rewrite it, to come out with brand new theories. It's triggered an interest in ancient civilizations, lost pages of history, a la the work of Graham Hancock and myself and my colleagues, you know, and it's revitalizing all of this. But why is it all happening now? What is it that we need to know about this? Are we even on the right course about getting answers here about what exactly might lie beneath the southeastern corner area of the second pyramid? It's something that we need to find out. It's something obviously that I'm talking about in the new book, you know, Beneath the Pyramids, the revised edition. But it's also something which myself and my good friend and colleague, Debbie Cartwright, will be looking at next February when we go out to Egypt for a couple of weeks to try and take everything that I've said here onto the next level. And it's a tour, it's organized in association with Megalithomania and Hugh Newman, but it's far, far more than that. We are looking for answers. We want to know why all this is happening, what's going on. We want to take it on to the next level. And if you feel that you want to be a part of this, then please come with us. The information is to be found. I'll put the link underneath this, megalithomania.co.uk. You can click through that for further information. Yes, of course, it's a tour, but it's also a quest of discovery. And we really will get answers, and you will be a part of that as and when it takes place. So that's it for the moment. But I can only encourage you to secure a copy of Beneath the Pyramids. Most of what I've talked about today is in there, and you know something big is taking place, and I want you to be a part of it. I mean, yes, of course we're speculating, but I go beyond simply the material um, theories. I do genuinely believe that there's something else going on here and we need to know about it. So, with that, I'm going to say thank you, and thank you for hanging on till the end here. And I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.